Good evening. Tragedy in London today on the River Thames. A pleasure boat carrying more than 100, perhaps as many as 150 birthday revelers was rammed and sunk by a barge. There were many deaths.
And workers prepared body bags for victims they expected to find as the recovery operation continued.
The night wasn't supposed to end like this for the 127 partygoers on the hot, cloudless evening of August 20th, 1989. The drinks were flowing, music was playing, and the young, attractive people on the pleasure boat Marchioness felt invincible. They felt invincible, but like all of us, they were not.
And then we just saw this huge vessel coming towards us. It can't possibly hit us.
The other boat did hit them, and the Marchioness did sink swiftly and mercilessly, killing 51 people. The accident was horrific, but in the end, it was what happened after the accident with the coroner that makes this such an interesting and disturbing story to tell. It was Antonio de Vasconcellos' 26th birthday. John Pang, his best friend and classmate from his Cambridge economics days, had secured a boat with tidal cruises to take them down the Thames. This group brought style, indulgence, and exuberance wherever they went. After dinner with close friends at John's flat, they met up with more friends and business associates where they would embark on their moonlit party cruise. That night, 127 revelers boarded the Marchioness. She was a 33-ton steamship, 85 feet long and 14 feet wide. She had a long, interesting history beyond her current life as a river disco. She was built in 1923 as a pleasure vessel, but became a hospital emergency transport during World War II. She even helped evacuate soldiers at Dunkirk in 1940. Acquired by Tidal Cruises in 1979, 3 decks were added for guests to drink, dance, and dine on. In 1989, the cost was £695 for 5 hours of cruising and dancing from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. The Marchioness left at 1:25 a.m., set to travel east to Greenwich and then back. It was now 1:40 a.m., the early hours of August 20th. In the dark, aft of the Marchioness, a hulking, 1,800-ton, 262-foot-long, 45-foot-wide vessel closed in upon them in the dark. This was the Bowbell, a dredger built in 1964. The Bowbell was massive and absolutely dwarfed the little Marchioness. People had just begun to dance as they passed between Cannon Street Railway Bridge and the Suffolk Bridge. Annette Russell, a business partner of the birthday boy Antonio, was on the top deck. A friend said, "Annette, look at that, it's going to hit us." Annette turned just in time to see the Bowbell slam into the Marchioness. Bowbell didn't really hit the Marchioness so much as tear her apart. Traveling around 5.5 knots to the Marchioness's 3 knots, the Bowbell hit the Marchioness twice. First, she hit the pleasure vessel 20 feet away from her stern, forcing the Marchioness to pivot around perpendicular to the Bowbell's bow. Then, Bowbell hit the Marchioness again, this time on her side, tearing apart her upper decks, tipping her over, and bulldozing her under, ground downward into the Thames. Instantly, water rushed into the Marchioness. It took a shocking 30 seconds for her to sink. Right after the Bowbell hit, the lights aboard Marchioness went out. Survivors say an anchor from the Bowbell came through a window. People were thrown about, grabbing desperately for their friends. Then they were all in the water, battling both the current in the Thames and the sinking of their own boat, which threatened to drag them down and entomb them. As the boat tipped and water swallowed the passengers, in the darkness it was hard to tell up from down. Survivor Odette Penwarden remembered it was like going inside a washing machine. Ian Philpott was able to get free of the Marchioness and cling to an empty beer barrel with a few others. The Marchioness's sister ship, the Hurlingham, another pleasure cruiser nearby on the Thames that night, stopped where the Marchioness sank and began throwing flotation devices into the water. Another boat, the Royal Princess, also stopped to offer aid. The ships on the river that night were radioed and told to come and offer assistance to the Marchioness. But you know who did not stop to help? The Bowbell. The Bowbell, which was not damaged in the crash and had no reason not to render aid. Captain Douglas Henderson, more on him later, basically hit the Marchioness, crushed her under, and then was like, "Oh shoot, did I bump into something?" Captain Henderson radioed the Thames Navigation Service and said, "I have to get underway now and proceed out through the bridges. I believe I have struck a pleasure craft. It is sunk. I'm getting clear of the bridges now. I was distracted by flashing lights from another pleasure craft. My vessel was proceeding outward bound, just approaching Cannon Street Bridge, and, well, I just lost steerage. And I don't really know after that. I can't really say anything else." This wasn't even Bowbell's first rodeo hitting things. She had hit the Cannon Street Bridge, the same bridge involved in this accident in 1982. While the Bowbell did nothing, Marchioness's mate, Andrew McGowan, made what might have been the single most important choice for saving lives. When the Bowbell first hit, he was thrown clear of the pleasure boat. But instead of swimming away, McGowan went back to the capsized boat, climbed onto the hull, and opened a door to the dance floor, making it possible for people to escape. Many people survived only because of McGowan's quick actions. Annette Russell, the woman who had seen the collision from the top deck, instinctively dove off the deck into the Thames. Russell described going beneath the surface of the water, and as I came up, mine was the only head in the water. I remember it being completely silent. I could see the Marchioness was vertical and had already half sunk. Then I was pulled back underwater and was taken away by the current. The current pulled her through the Suffolk Bridge arches and underneath the water again. This time when she surfaced, she wasn't alone, and it wasn't silent. There were screams. Heads bobbed in the water, trying to swim, trying to get to the banks of the Thames. But the current was strong, and those who managed to free themselves from the Marchioness had to fight to get to the banks. Some were found as far as half a mile from where the boat went under. You can see here now, in the middle of the day, how an accident like this would galvanize everyone around here. People would try and immediately help. You could see what was going on. But in the middle of the night, in the pitch darkness, so many people just disappeared either under the water or down the river. Police and fireboats arrived on the scene, though originally they had been sent to the wrong place in the Thames. There was aid from other ships, and helicopters searched the waters until dawn. Unfortunately, when a ship goes down, every minute is a matter of life or death. The 80 people who survived the sinking were all saved within the first 30 minutes. Not a single person was saved after the first 30-minute mark. 51 people died. 24 bodies were recovered from inside the wreck of the Marchioness the following day. They had to lower the water level in the Thames to accomplish the recovery. Over the following days, the 27 unaccounted-for victims were found scattered all down the Thames. The dead included Antonio de Vasconcelos, whose birthday the group was celebrating, Annette Russell's friend, Howard Dennis, who saw the Bowbell was about to hit, and the captain of the Marchioness, Stephen Faldo. The average age of the passengers aboard that night was 22. But how did this happen? In 2000, 11 years after the accident, an investigation concluded basically it was poor lookout on behalf of both vessels. They didn't see each other. And while it's true that neither ship seemed to have had adequate lookouts or have been adequately lit, that conclusion makes it sound so tame and sanitized. And it's only one tiny piece of the story. let me fill you in on what it was like aboard the Bowbell. Before starting his shift in charge of a giant boat in an extremely busy London waterway, Captain Douglas Henderson went to the pub and had 6 pints of beer before starting work at 1 a.m. Experts think that enough time had passed so he was technically unimpaired, but 6 pints and then a nap is not always the recipe for snappy thinking and reactions. Even if Douglas was sober, there are questions about the lookout, Terence Blaney. Before his shift as a lookout on the 1,800-ton river dredger, Blaney had a total of 8 drinks, 4 cans of bitter and 4 pints of lager. Then there was the lookout system, which was just shouting. The system was shouting, like, hey, there's a boat, let's not hit it. They had radios, they just didn't use them. We came across a piece of reporting stating Blaney had received no instructions as to what he was to look out for or to report. Now, I'm no expert lookout myself, but the lookout should be looking out for things like bridges, icebergs, other boats. Does the lookout really need to be told this? So the captain and the lookout are either inebriated, groggy, or both, and the lookout notification system on this giant boat is shouting, and visibility is poor all around. Adding to this cast of characters on the Bowbell was the helmsman, the man steering the boat, who wore a hearing aid, which doesn't mean he can't do his job, just that the casual shouting system from the lookout might not have been the best fit. After obliterating the Marchioness and just carrying on down the Thames, Captain Henderson of the Bowbell launched neither lifeboats nor flotation devices into the water. They didn't stop until they were, quote, clear of the area. When asked if he heard screams coming from the river, Henderson replied, "I do not like to recall. I just don't know." When asked if he saw people in the water, he said, "I'm not sure whether I did or not." When asked by a representative of the victims' families, "Was there anything you would have done in a different manner?" Henderson said, "I would have made sure the lookout had written instructions, because it would have saved a lot of questions." But perhaps the most chilling response Henderson gave was when he was asked why he didn't launch any lifeboats for the victims. He responded, "At the time, it was not a matter that was one of my top priorities. I did not give any consideration to releasing them." Not a matter that was one of my top priorities. Captain Henderson was tried in court twice for failing to keep a proper lookout, but both times the trial resulted in a hung jury. A later attempt to prosecute the captain also failed, and ultimately nobody was held legally responsible for the Marchioness collision. If you've been watching our channel for a while, you know that we never tell just a straight disaster story. Marchioness's 51 dead were not just victims of a horrific boat crash, but of a cadaver crime. A crime inflicted upon their bodies after they were already dead, adding to the indignity of their situation. In instances of mass death, such as this one, swift identification of the bodies is of the utmost importance. However, in the aftermath of the Marchioness, it seemed like almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The first issue was who the victims were. Many, including Antonio, were wealthy and gay. A mother who lost her daughter that night would say there was a perception right from the start that the dead were yuppies and that somehow they did not deserve proper sympathy. In the rescue effort, there seemed to be an obsessive fear that the bodies themselves might have AIDS, given that it was a party of, quote, homosexuals and lesbians. Madeline Anderton, who survived severely injured, remembered that her rescuers and medical staff were, quote, more concerned to check her for potential AIDS than to attend to her injuries. As bodies were found in the Thames, they were brought to the Wapping police station, which acted as a temporary morgue. Westminster coroner Paul Knapman was responsible for those bodies and was assisted by forensic pathologist for London and Southeast England, Dr. Richard Shepherd. It was a grim sight at the Wapping station, with open body bags covering the ground in what was just a back room with a concrete floor. Dr. Shepard said that in each body bag lay the body of a young adult, all dressed for a party, many in bright colors. The bodies were tagged at the station and then transferred to the mortuary, which, important distinction, doesn't mean a funeral home. Mortuary is what would be known as a morgue in the United States, a place of more formal death investigation. This mortuary in Westminster was where the men were tasked with figuring out how each person had died, finding clues to what happened the night of the collision, and most importantly, identifying who each victim actually was. This is the stage where mistakes were made and judgment was impressively bad. What's worse, it would take 11 years to get a public inquiry and some answers into how it all went so wrong. Let's start with the notification process for the families and loved ones of those who were missing or dead. Now, this process is rarely going to proceed flawlessly. The scene is chaotic after a huge accident like this, but protocols seem to fail here at multiple levels. Nobody seemed to know how many people had been aboard, who was alive, who was dead, and who had been accounted for. Do you remember Annette Russell? After the incident, she was being treated at the Howard Hotel on the Embankment, a site being used to hold survivors, ask them questions, and act as a central information center. As Annette sat reeling from the night, she learned the police had already been to her parents' home and told them Annette was missing and presumed dead. At one point, Annette was asked to look at the identification records of a close friend who had been aboard the boat. What she discovered was that the records were all wrong. Quote, "They stated my friend was white. She wasn't. She was black. They said she didn't have pierced ears. She did. They said that she was 5'9" tall. She was 5'5". It broke my heart. Why didn't they just let me identify her in the first place? I had to choose the coffin and pay for it to be sent back, but to this day, I still don't know whether I sent the right body home to her family in Australia." At first, this sounds like a paranoid fear of Annette's, that the body of a victim would have her race completely misidentified and that the wrong body would be sent across the world. But that exact scenario actually happened. A black family was given the body of a white man instead of their black son for burial. At this point, you might be asking, why didn't they just let the families visually identify their dead loved ones? Or why didn't they let someone like Annette Russell, who knew many of the people on board, both physically and from their clothing, and who had volunteered to identify the dead for other families, why didn't they let her see the bodies? The quick answer to that is that Paul Knappman, the coroner, along with his team and the police, decided that it would be too distressing for the family to see the bodies from the Thames. Dr. Shepard supported this decision, saying it would be, quote, "utterly inhumane." Would it have been utterly inhumane? These were bodies that had been submerged in the water for hours, if not days. Even after a short time submerged, the skin of a corpse will become pale and wrinkly. Depending on how long the body has been in the water, there could be various stages of skin slippage, when the top layers of the skin separate from the deeper layers and the skin sloughs off. Combine that with the body potentially getting knocked around in the Thames, being nibbled on by animals, bloated by decomposition. It's understandable why a coroner might warn a family member about visually identifying a body. After a disaster, your dead loved one just doesn't look the way you remember them from when they were alive, and misidentification in those scenarios is always a potential danger. But I don't believe giving the families the option to perform this identification would have been inhumane, since I've found that if families are warned in detail about the body's condition beforehand, they can handle a great deal, especially if this was someone they loved. For many people, they'd rather see their son a bit discolored or bloated than never see their son ever again. And, in fact, years later, when some families were shown the photographs of these supposed horrifying bloated bodies of their children, their response was that of enormous relief, as they were nowhere near as bad as they had been picturing. So, visual identification, though we may not agree with the reasoning, was out. But the bodies still needed to be properly identified. What about DNA testing? Though DNA testing had become widely used as early as 1986, and this was 1989, it wasn't made available for the Marchioness victims. What about dental records? That was an option for some, but in order to identify someone through dental records, you have to have some idea whose dental records you're looking at. And that level of organization, according to the coroner, just wasn't present. So the decision was made. They would identify the dead through fingerprints, a very common procedure, normally. At first, Coroner Knapman and Dr. Shepard went about fingerprinting the bodies through the usual police inking process. But as bodies continued to come in, for the bodies that had been in the water for days, the standard procedure was becoming impossible. I mentioned skin slippage, which happens during decomposition. When that slippage happens at the hands, it's known, somewhat on the nose, as degloving. Basically, skin coming off fingers and toes. And fingers in that condition don't always have enough skin to obtain successful prints. Now, there was a specialist technique that could get prints from degloved hands. But the lab they wanted to use didn't have the needed storage or any way to handle keeping the full dead bodies of the victims on the premises. So the hands of the dead bodies that needed to be identified were severed, cut off their dead bodies, and sent away to the lab. While this may sound horrifying, it was not an unheard of procedure at the time. Coroners have quite a lot of power when it comes to making decisions in death investigations, especially when there's potential criminality involved. And it's common for coroners to keep organs or tissue for further examination. As for removing and keeping hands, which admittedly is way more rare, Dr. Shepard called it the routine process for individual bodies recovered from the Thames at the time. The intention was always to eventually reattach the hands to the correct bodies after the identification procedure had been done. In all, 25 recovered bodies had their hands removed and sent off for identification. Some bodies also had tissue taken from them, from the brain, spleen, lungs, or kidney. While an uncomfortable topic, I think we can all agree that this is something that you gently but transparently communicate to the victim's loved ones. Keeping the tissue samples, even organs, is one thing, but removing entire body parts is a whole different level. But nobody told the families that their sons' and daughters' hands had been cut off. They were told only that blood and urine samples had been taken from the victims. What's worse, most families didn't learn that their loved ones' hands had been removed until 11 years later at the inquiry. The families didn't know because they were discouraged or outright forbidden from viewing their loved ones' bodies before burial. It gets worse. Here's the cherry on top of this horrifying post-mortem Sunday. 3 sets of hands were misplaced and were never reattached to the bodies they came from. At least one set of those hands, the hands of Elsa Garcia, were destroyed in 1993 by the coroner's orders when a staff member decided to clean out the fridge and found random hands wrapped in a garbage bag. Elsa Garcia's body was exhumed from her grave in Spain in 2001 because her mother was never confident that she had been sent the correct body for burial. The exhumation confirmed that the body did belong to Elsa. The exhumation also confirmed that she had been sent to Spain and buried with no hands. Her mother said of the coroner, "He has committed the most atrocious act by not allowing me to see my daughter." Like the collision between the Marchioness and Bobel itself, when asked how this all could happen, there were no satisfying answers. Coroner Knapman maintained that it was unfortunate that his actions caused the family's pain, but he assumed the most important thing was that they receive identifications as quickly as possible. The ends justified the means. The secret hand removal made perfect sense to achieve that goal. To have acted otherwise, said Knapman, could have added a week's uncertainty for those families. Are those really the only 2 options? The first option is wait a week for positive identification, or the second option is your daughter's hands are still in the back of my fridge 4 years later? The coroner also maintained that this was a complex situation. and that no one could have been prepared for it. He admitted to no wrongdoing, but he did say that he should have been more explicit in communicating what was going on with the hands. Quote, "I did not fully recognize the distress that further disfigurement of the bodies might cause." During the inquiry, the mother of Dean Palmer, one of the victims, stood up and yelled at the coroner, "If your mortuary is so dirty you cannot find a pair of hands for 4 years, you are no less than a butcher." Again, with all the errors in judgment before, during, and after the Marchioness disaster, you think somebody answered for all those lost lives and what happened to the bodies afterwards, but no one did. Captain Henderson of the Bowbell was acquitted, and Paul Knapman continued to serve as Westminster coroner until 2011, another 22 years before he retired. In an article examining his 3 decades-long career, Knapman was asked about the anger directed at him from the Marchioness families. He told the interviewer, quote, "Of course it was regrettable. I don't think there was sufficient appreciation at the time that all London coroners gave consent for unidentified drowned bodies to have their hands removed if police wanted it. And that happened to probably a couple dozen bodies every year in the 1970s and 80s. In those days, there was a patrician attitude that you did not need to tell people details they did not need to know." Putting on my little death professional PR hat here, you can acknowledge that norms were different 30 years ago while still showing sincere regret. I would have gone with something like, "I, Coroner Knapman, deeply regret that the prevailing norm at the time was to withhold information from the families. It obviously caused a great deal of pain, and I'm sorry that it took me so long to learn that. It haunts me." It's now decades after the sinking of the Marchioness, and despite how grim every part of this was, there is somewhat of a bright spot to her legacy. At the time of the Marchioness accident, safety along the Thames was poor. Response by authorities was slow, and there was no lifeboat stations. This was a pivotal reason as to why so many died on that August night. Help just wasn't close enough. In 2002, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution placed 4 permanent lifeboat stations on the Thames. 2 are now the busiest in the UK. The decision to do this was directly connected to the findings of the 2000 inquiry. When they are notified of an accident by the Coast Guard, life-saving teams are dispatched within seconds. It's those seconds that may be preventing Marchioness-level accidents on the Thames. As of 2019, their services have saved 580 lives and aided almost 5,000 people. During the inquiry, it was found that victims drowned because even if they managed to make it to the embankment, it was too steep for them to pull themselves out, hence installing the grab chains. You can see behind me on the bases of the bridge the chains that people can grab onto if they've fallen in the river, and that's because of the Marchioness that those were put there. In September of 1989, in nearby Suffolk Cathedral, Princess Diana attended a memorial service for the Marchioness victims. Shortly after, a permanent memorial stone was placed in the cathedral with the names of the victims. It reads, "Many waters cannot quench love." When we cover a maritime disaster, we tend to choose incidents that are decades, if not centuries, behind us. But the Marchioness was so recent. It happened on my 5th birthday, actually, and it's particularly poignant because people are still alive who carry the memory of those who died. When I was in London for this project, I met someone completely by chance who was supposed to be on the Marchioness that night and decided against it at the last minute. Ripples from the disaster are still being felt, and the legacy of the Marchioness is unfolding and evolving. A thank you to the Ocean Liner Designs team who created the beautiful animations of the Marchioness and Bowbell modeled from scratch for this documentary. Thank you also to our patrons who free us, how they free us, from focusing on views and metrics and subscribers, and instead encourage us to research stories that have, by some, been forgotten.